Hey everyone, welcome back to TMac FPV. In this video I'm going to show you how to become a better FPV pilot simply by finding the best rates for you, both freestyle and race style, which will help you make progress on your journey to better FPV fun flights and racing stuff. Stay tuned. What initially prompted me to do the topic for this video was we came across a question from one of our fellow FPV pilots who had been doing some freestyle flying, but he wanted to get better at racing. He was having a bit of a challenge maintaining a low altitude, with his biggest problem being that he was dipping down going through the gates. He was actually bobbing up and down in altitude. One thing that we wanted to point out here was he correctly acknowledges the fact that there's a different type of flying for freestyle than there is for racing. And when it comes to racing, you tend to have precision going through those small gates. With precision comes the need for better throttle resolution. So the way we answered this was twofold. To begin with, we stated that he ought to try some throttle limit scaling type in Betaflight. And we've done a video previously on this and how to accomplish it. If you missed that, go ahead and check it out in the upper right hand corner of the screen through this card. When you do this throttle limit scaling type in Betaflight, what that allows you to do is to have better throttle resolution and therefore better throttle management, which will allow you to maintain the correct altitude for the obstacle that you're going through, over, around, whatever the case may be. The second aspect to our answer was racing style tends to lend itself better towards lower rates than the rates for freestyle. So in this video, we're going to take a look at both the rates for racing type flying as well as for freestyle flying, acknowledging that there are two different rate sets that you may want to consider using for those different types of flying styles. Make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you're ready to become a better FPV pilot. And in this video, here's specifically what we're going to cover. First, we're going to take a look at what rates are. Then we'll explain how to go ahead and change them using both the Betaflight Configurator and the Betaflight OSD. We'll also take a look at a few well-known pilots' rates as examples and use the average of those pilots' rates to formulate a base freestyle and also a base race rate set for you to start with, which you can tweak over time. Then we'll show you how to put those two rate sets on your transmitter switch so that you can change between freestyle and racing style flying just with a flip of a switch. Before we go any further, I wanted to dispel a myth which may be out there, that being that higher rates equate to being a better pilot or a better flight experience. That's simply not the case. What we all should be concerned about is what are the best rates for each of us that will help us to be better pilots with a better flying experience. For example, you may be a better pilot with lower rates than I am trying to fly higher rates. So what are these rates that we're talking about? The rates we're talking about are these numbers in the RC rate column, the super rate column, as well as the RC expo column. The rates are simply how your quad responds to your stick movements and the position of your stick. Specifically, the RC rate is a linear relationship between your stick movement and the quadcopter's movement. The super rate and the RC expo simply add a curve to that linear relationship. To change these numbers, you can either use these up and down arrows or simply highlight it and type in whatever number you would like and hit enter. As you change these numbers, RC rate, super rate, and RC expo, it will change these curves over here. You have one curve for each one of the axes, roll, pitch, and yaw, color-coded. Red, roll, green is pitch, and blue is yaw. So let's go back to the default. These are default values which I'm showing at this point in time. So these are the values that currently come up as defaults in this configurator. Now there's a new configurator coming out here in a couple weeks, 10.6, and as well as Betaflight 4.1. Currently we are on the previous version, and we're on, I don't even know what Betaflight this is, 4.0 point something. It's irrelevant for this discussion. So when you change these numbers, the curve of each one of these axes will change over here in this graph. Let's go ahead and take a look at how to read this graph. To make it easier to explain, I've just expanded that rates graph here. This line represents how your quad responds to your stick input, so I'm going to call this line your quad response curve. At the origin or center of your two axes is your center stick position on your transmitter. The horizontal axis represents your stick position, and when at full stick deflection over here, it's at 100%. Therefore, when halfway deflected, it's at 50%. Your vertical axis is depicting how fast your quadcopter is reacting to your stick input at that particular stick position, i.e. how fast it's rotating around that particular axis, either the roll, pitch, or yaw axis in degrees per second. So for example, if this red line was representing how your quad responds to your stick inputs on the roll axis, if you had your stick fully deflected to 100%, your quad would be rolling or spinning around the roll axis at 800 degrees per second. At 50% deflection or halfway deflected, your quadcopter would be rolling or spinning around the roll axis at 400 degrees per second, and so on. So obviously the slope of this line, how steep it is very important to how your quad responds to your stick movements. If I were to make this line less steep or more shallow, having less slope, then at full stick deflection, for example, it may only be rolling at 180 degrees per second, and at half stick deflection, with this linear relationship between your stick input and the quadcopter's response, the quad would be rolling at 90 degrees per second. As I mentioned earlier, the RC rate numbers you put into the RC rate column will determine the slope of this linear relationship throughout the entire range of our stick deflection, 0 to 100%. The RC expo number you place in the last column simply changes the shape of your quadcopter's response from that of a linear relationship to a curve. It's called an exponential curve, hence the term expo. It keeps the maximum rotation of your quadcopter the same at full stick deflection while reducing the slope of the curve around center stick, which means your quad's going to respond less aggressively to your stick inputs in that area, but still have the same response at full stick deflection. The super rate numbers you're going to place in the second column also change your quad's response to your stick inputs from that of a linear relationship to an exponential curve. However, the super rate numbers affect both how your quadcopter responds around center stick and the maximum rotation rate of your quad at full stick deflection. Let's go into Betaflight and see how the shape of this quad response curve changes as we actually change each of the RC rate, RC expo, and super rate numbers. All right, the numbers we're going to be changing are the RC rate, super rate, and RC expo, and we're only going to do it on the roll axis just to save time. So as we change these numbers, take a look at the graph over here for our quad response curve, looking at the red curve. We're going to change these one at a time. So let's go ahead and put this down to 0.01. And when we do that, the only thing that is basically affecting the curve at this point in time now is the RC rate, which is at 1. And you can see the slope of this linear relationship between your stick inputs on your transmitter and the quadcopter, as we explained earlier. So as we increase this number, the slope of this linear relationship is going to increase, and your quadcopter is going to respond more aggressively both around center stick as well as out here at full stick deflection. So let's change this from 1.0 to 1.25. And you can see how the slope of the line changed. And let's change it to 1.5. Once again, it increased. Let's go all the way up to 2. And there you can see it increased again. So taking it back down to 1. So you can see here that the RC rate, by changing the RC rate, it changes the slope of the linear relationship between your stick inputs and your quadcopter. We're going to leave this at 1 now, and let's see what happens when we add expo to this linear relationship. So we're going to change it from 0 to 0.1. Keep in mind, at full stick deflection on the roll axis, before we make this change, it's at 202 degrees per second at full stick deflection. And you can see it's still at 202 degrees per second. You did see the line change into somewhat more of a curve when we made that change. Let's make a more drastic change here. There you see it's starting to become more of an exponential curve, but once again, the endpoint at full stick deflection, your quadcopter is responding in the roll axis at 202 degrees per second. Take it up to 0.75. And it changed again. And what you're seeing is, although the endpoint at full stick deflection, your quad is responding the same at full stick deflection, the slope of the quad response curve is actually less around center stick than it was when we had it at 0. You saw it jump down here. So when we add RC Expo, we're softening the quadcopter's response around center stick while still maintaining the quadcopter's same responsiveness at full stick deflection. We're going to go ahead and change this back to 0 and take a look at what the super rate does. So if I take super rate, we're only messing with this roll curve here. If I take super rate from basically 0 to 0.5, watch the red curve. You'll see it went from 202 degrees per second all the way up to 400 degrees per second at full stick deflection, while at the same time increasing the quadcopter's responsiveness around center stick. So it didn't soften it, it made it more aggressive around center stick while making the full stick deflection more aggressive as well. So if we take this all the way up to 1, you can see how drastically the quadcopter is going to respond now at full stick deflection, 1998 degrees per second. This is probably not something that you want to do, because in this area, although the quadcopter is responding similarly around center stick at about 50%, once you start moving your stick beyond 50%, it's going to have a drastic aggressive maneuver. And around this elbow, I'll call this an elbow of the curve, it's going to be extremely difficult to control the quadcopter. So you want a more gradual transition to your quadcopter's response curve than you do this drastic elbow here. Now, to get a feel for the rates that you've actually input into your 3 columns, whatever they may be, and keep in mind you can always start off with the default rates as your baseline and tweak each number as you go along, or in just a few minutes we're going to establish baselines for both freestyle and racing style rates that you can also use as a jumping off point. But to get a feel for the rates that you've actually input, you can scroll down to this 3D model and go to full stick deflection. In this case, I'm going to pitch forward with the default rates, and you can get a feel for how it rotates on that particular axis. Roll. And yaw. Those were the defaults. Now let's go ahead and change them to, let's make this 2 on the roll axis. Scroll back down, and let's check out what it looks like now when we go max deflection on the roll axis. Much faster. That would be difficult for me to control. But that's how you can use this 3D model to do a rates preview, as the section is titled, to get a feel for whatever rates you're playing with in the Betaflight configurator. Some example freestyle pilots rates are depicted here for LeDrib, StingersSwarm, and Mr. Steele. For Mr. Steele's rates, Steele runs KISS instead of Betaflight, so the rates that are listed here are a Betaflight curve fit approximation to his KISS rates. And these are somewhat of outliers as compared with these. So when we go ahead and average LeDrib and StingersSwarm rates together, what we end up with are these rates here. And when you insert these into the 3 columns of Betaflight, you end up with these degrees per second rotation for the roll, pitch, and yaw axis. My personal recommendation would be to start the max degrees per second for your roll and pitch approximately the same at around 750 degrees per second. So what I would do personally is I would make this roll rate, super rate, and expo to be exactly the same as your pitch and go from there. However, that's totally up to you, but that's what I'm going to do as a baseline. And honestly, those aren't that far off from the default values. Now what you can also do is go to github.com, Betaflight, and Betaflight Wiki Rate Calculator, and there's 2 things underneath there that you can play with to get a good feel for the type of curve that you're going to get with various rates. The first one is this Betaflight Rates Tuner from a gentleman named Eric Spen FPV. As a matter of fact, Eric Spen FPV was one of our first students in our Fast Track FPV course. He was an experienced pilot at the time. If you're interested in the Fast Track FPV course, you can check out the link in the video description below or in the card over here on the right-hand side of the screen. What Eric Spen did for the Betaflight Rates Tuner is you can go ahead and load pilots' rates, various pilots' rates, or the default Betaflight rates, and he's got different racer rates in here. So for an example, you can go to SFPV, which I believe is San Francisco FPV. He's very active on Velocidrone Racing League, and you can take a look at his rates. Or Minchan, who runs Flight 1, and these are the Betaflight equivalent of his Flight 1 rates, I believe. The other tool underneath this URL is RotoPirates, and he's got a conversion algorithm here between race flight rates, KISS rates, and Betaflight rates. And this is actually the tool that I used when I came up with the approximation, or the curve fit approximation for Mr. Steele's rates. I input his KISS rates, which he mentioned in one of his videos, and for all 3 axes, and I clicked calculate others, and it spit out the Betaflight rates here. So those are some freestyle pilots rates, as well as the average of LeDrib and StingersSwarm here. And as I mentioned, I personally would go with the same roll numbers as he has, or as we've got here for pitch, and potentially the same for yaw as my baseline, and then I would go from there. Let's take a look at some racing rates from some well-known race pilots. So here are some example race rates from some well-known race pilots: Minchan, Headsup, and Nytfury. You can take a look at these numbers for roll and pitch are fairly similar between Minchan and Headsup, and not too far off is Nytfury. And Nytfury's yaw and Minchan's yaw is approximately the same. Now, one thing I do want to mention is this is a snapshot in time. Just because you establish rates at one point in time during your FPV journey doesn't mean you're going to keep the same rates throughout the rest of your life. As you progress and gain more experience and your pilot skills change, hopefully for the better, you may find that you're changing your rates. So I don't know, the reason I make that statement is I don't know if these individuals are currently flying these rates now as we speak, as of the posting of this video, or not. These were the most recent rates that I was able to pull up at the time of the posting of this video. And if you look at the average of the rates for Minchan, Headsup, and Nytfury, you end up with these rates. And these are looking pretty good as a baseline race rate to start with. If you compare these rotation rates on roll, pitch, and yaw for racing style to the previous freestyle average that we came up with, there's a drastic difference. Obviously, with this much difference in your rotation rate on each of these three axes, the flight characteristics of your quadcopter are going to be completely different. That's why I recommend setting up two different rate sets on a switch using two different profiles in the Adjustments tab of Betaflight, and we'll quickly go over that here shortly. Okay, so now that we've got our baseline for both our race rates and our freestyle rates, we can go ahead and set them up on different profiles, which I've already done here. On Rate Profile 1, you could go to this Rate Profile tab, it's a drop-down menu, and you can set up different profiles in conjunction with the Adjustments tab, which we'll go to next. I'm going to put them on a 3-position switch. So on Rate Profile 1, I went ahead and put my baseline race style rates here, and you can see the max velocity in degrees per second in this column. Now keep in mind, you want to base your rates tuning, if you will, off of the max deflection of your transmitter stick. If you find over time that you're consistently not able to control the quad coming out of rolls or flips from max stick deflection because it's too fast, that probably means your rates are too high, and you'll want to try and experiment with lowering them and see if that helps out. On Rate Profile 3, I've set up our baseline freestyle rates, which obviously are going to be higher than the race style rates that we set up. And then, since we've got a 3-position switch, what I did is I set up Rate Profile 2, splitting the difference between the race style rates and the freestyle rates. So the velocity, max velocity in degrees per second at max stick deflection is halfway in between my race style baseline rates and my freestyle baseline rates. Now, that's how you set this up on your Rate Profiles tab over here under PID Tuning. To get it on a switch, you go to your Adjustments tab, and after you've set up the switch with your transmitter, and all of this stuff to include setting it up on the rate profile, your rate profiles here, and the Adjustments tab, and setting the mixer page up on your transmitter, we've gone ahead and developed a straightforward, easy to follow checklist in PDF format, which you can download for free through a link in the video description below. So I'm not going to go through each step in detail here. I'm just doing the overview. Go into the Adjustments tab, you just pick out the aux channel that you're using for your mixer, and then over here you select Rate Profile, slot 1 for the first adjustments, and if you've got more than one adjustment that you're setting up, you need to make sure and have slot 2 selected. So when we flip our transmitter switch from rate 1 on the first setting, then I flip it to the middle, and it goes to rate 2, and then I flip it again to rate 3. So just by the flip of a switch, I can switch between race rates, freestyle rates, or somewhere in between. And the somewhere in between you can actually set up to use as experimental rates, and you can fluctuate those so that in between flights you can go ahead and flip back and forth if you want to test out different rates. In addition to being able to change between rate profiles with a switch, as we're doing here, you can make incremental changes to your rates through your Betaflight OSD in between flights to test out different numbers in each of those RC rate, RC Expo, and Super rate columns. We'll go ahead and take a look at that now. Once you're in your Betaflight OSD, go to Profile, and from there you can go to your rate profile and actually select any one of the rate profiles that you set up previously to fly with. Then you can go to the Rate tab and actually change the specific numbers for that rate profile you selected to include your RC rate, Super rate, and RC Expo. I know if you use this process to establish your baseline rates and experiment with them incrementally to fit your specific flying styles, you're going to quickly and drastically improve your flying skills. Make sure to grab your free Rates on a Switch checklist through the link in the video description below. Smash that subscribe button and check out our new TMacFPV.com website. Thank you for your time. We'll see you in the next video. Clear skies, friend.